and urgency in a time of change. As you may imagine, with the COVID-19 epidemic restricting our abilities to do various things, we have also encountered the silver lining of Zoom calls, which lets us have a direct interaction with our first Monday speakers that is perhaps more robust and reaches a wider audience. So we're very glad to welcome you from around the country. There are over 300 people who registered for our online discussion through Zoom, and more who are available watching it on our YouTube channel, Pendle Hill USA. A couple of logistical admonitions. You are all coming into this muted, and you will remain so throughout the course of the talk. You will be given an opportunity to talk with each other as prompted by Ricardo. However, if you are experiencing any difficulties with the technology, please enter your request in the chat. At the bottom of your page, there is a little icon that looks like a balloon with a cartoon balloon with an arrow on it, and you can click that and direct your questions to Francisco Burgos, who is our Director of Education and who will be becoming the Executive Director of Pendle Hill starting on September 1st. Meanwhile, he is being our technological expert and managing to help everybody make sure that they are able to participate in tonight's experiment. Also, if questions arise during the course of Ricardo's presentation, or you've already thought are burning on your heart and you would like to ask them, please write those into chat. You are not able to chat with each other, but you are able to direct your chat to Francisco, who will then forward the questions to me, and we will have an opportunity to regard those questions, and then I will act as sort of a moderator by asking Ricardo the questions that you have asked. Obviously, we will not be able to answer all of your questions tonight. I'd also draw your attention to chat for another purpose, and that is many people have expressed a desire to help out with the situation in Minneapolis in particular. Ricardo is and has been extraordinarily involved with an organization called MPD 150. It was 150 years from 1867 to 2017. 150 years of policing in Minneapolis. And the conclusion of that historical review was that Minneapolis would do better in directing its resources in other directions than policing. And so there's a movement towards community self-engagement and self-regulation on a restorative justice model. There are several organizations. Fortunately, MPD 150 at the moment is actually well-funded. There are some other more incipient organizations that are listed in the chat that you might direct your dollars toward. Of course, you could always direct them towards efforts within your own community. I'd also like to say that Ricardo makes his living by his art. And we, as Pendle Hill, have benefited greatly from his talents. He's a great friend of Pendle Hill. He's been involved in many of our conferences with Continuing Revolution 2019. Many of our conferences, he just directed Art as Medicine for Personal and Global Healing this past weekend, which was full. But as many artists, struggles during a period of time when he is not able to meet his public. So we would direct your attention to his website, which is in the chat room and is And now I'm going to have to look at chat to make sure it is there. www.rlm, as in Ricardo Levins Morales, artstudio.com. Many of us actually have come to know Ricardo based on his wonderful artwork in support of so many worthy social causes for economic and social justice. Prison reform, education reform, fair wages for laborers. Now let me introduce Ricardo. Ricardo himself describes himself as a healer and trickster organizer disguised as an artist. He was born into anti-colonial movement in his native Puerto Rico and was drawn into activism in Chicago when his family moved there in 1967, another time of extraordinary unrest, as you remember. Ricardo's activism has included support, work for the Black Panthers and Young Lords, and participating or acting in solidarity with farmers, environmental, labor, racial justice, and peace movements. Increasingly, Ricardo sees his art and organizing practices as a means to address individual, collective, and historical trauma. He co-leads workshops on trauma and resilience for organizers, as well as trainings on creative organizing, social justice strategy, and sustainable activism, and mentors and supports young activists. Ricardo's art has won numerous awards, but the greatest affirmation is the uses to which it has been put by grassroots movements and communities. You may learn more about Ricardo at www.rlmartstudio.com. Thank you for joining us this evening. I want to say on a personal note that I regard Ricardo as a personal friend and a great friend of Pendle Hills. Many of you will be enjoying his artwork as he designed our poster for our 90th anniversary, which we will be celebrating in September. And you may see that in an upcoming issue on the back cover of Friends Journal. I would like to invite us to take a moment of silence, hold Ricardo in the light as he prepares to deliver his message this evening. Thank you all.
There's no sound.
Shall we begin? All right. So thank you, John. Thank you, Pendle Hill. And thank all of you for showing up. Though if you're in cities like mine that are under martial law, all the options may be more limited than usual for how to spend the evening. When I looked at the way this evening was publicized, I saw that it said something along the lines of an evening with Ricardo Levins Morales, right? And that just sounds so nice and cozy. I like that. So I like the cozy informality of it. So I hope that anybody who likes tea has their cup handy or whatever else might make you feel cozy and connected. And of course, there's always chances to go and heat it up. So one thing I'll say in following up on John's introduction is that, absolutely, I would love it if people would come to the site, purchase art, share images around and so forth. But strangely enough, I have to say we're doing remarkably well for a little shop whose whole mission is to overthrow dominant systems wherever they are to be found. So who knew that you could get by with revolutionary art during the multiple crises that we're experiencing? So the title has to do with balancing urgency and patience in a time of change. And I'll start out by disappointing you and saying, I don't know the answers. This is not, where sort of there's a formula that we can follow, but it is a tension that certainly runs throughout any kind of efforts for social change. That we need to always be responding to the moment, and we also have to be working on a long-term vision that requires patience. And if we swing all the way into urgency, we won't be investing what we need to in the future that we want to see. And if we're only completely thinking about the future, we'll trip over things. We won't see what's right in front of us. We won't be able to respond to the pain around us and the relationships that need to be built. So rather than answers, I'll tell some stories and talk about a little bit of my story, how I got here, and also how these ideas about balancing the present and the future, urgency and patience, play into the crisis that we're experiencing right now. Minneapolis right now is at the epicenter of a growing rebellion that came on us like an earthquake and is an expression of, in some ways, of just sort of the shifting of tectonic plates, and also a reflection of some of the long-term and patient work that has been done in between crises here. And the foundation, really, of what I want to talk about is based on the knowledge that history, like nature, is cyclical. And cycles run in different kind of ways. We don't have time to go into all of it, but there are cycles like the cycle of the tides based on the moon, and that's a cycle that's predictable. It always comes at the same time every month, right? On the other hand, you have earthquakes and forest fires, that they're also cyclical, but they're not predictable in the same way, because they're about the accumulation of tension along tectonic faults on the one hand, or the accumulation of dry matter, burnable, wood and foliage in the forest. From the moment there's a forest fire, the accumulation begins of the material that will be fuel for the next forest fire, as plants and trees age and drop dead limbs and so forth. And the cycles of history are based more on that second model, right? Movements don't emerge like clockwork at a particular time, but they do emerge in response to the tensions and the experiences that accumulate over time after the last release of social tension in various kinds of upsurges. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some kind of general ideas about who we are and where we are and when we are before bringing those kind of larger principles into the moment that we're experiencing now. The three essential elements, what I call the three essential elements of social change and social movements, are clarity, capacity, and unity. And when we have those three in an effective balance, then we can make change. And when they're out of balance, it becomes harder to do so. And what we're going to be focusing on tonight is clarity, because being able to remember who we are, to know when we are, to remember how to move, having that clarity allows us to rebuild the other essential elements, our capacity and our unity. So we're talking about the fact that we're in a major crisis. And the reality is that we're always in a crisis for somebody. So that the crisis of racism is constantly felt in Black communities, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian, and other places where the weight is focused. So when the folks in the media and government and organizations talk about us being in a crisis, they really mean a crisis of the system. Because as long as that crisis can be sort of outsourced to poor communities, it's not felt to be a crisis in sort of the general language of the day. For example, recently, actually in the last period of the Obama administration, Puerto Rico, where I'm from, was going through a financial crisis, we were told. It was a manufactured crisis because it was based on all kinds of fake debts that the corrupt government officials and banks and hedge funds colluded to create. But nonetheless, it was a crisis. Why? Because Puerto Rico couldn't pay the banks. Already, it had been a crisis for the people of Puerto Rico, as the government here forced the cuts in social services, privatized schools, and so forth. So what the US did under the Obama administration is turn it over to a fiscal oversight board, what we in Puerto Rico call the junta, which was given full control, overriding the government and accelerating the privatization, basically breaking up Puerto Rico and selling it for parts in order to empower the hedge funds, who were the people sitting on this new board, hedge funds, bankers, people like that. And I was in communication with legislators, people in Congress before they voted on that board. And they were saying, there's a crisis, we have to be able to solve the crisis. And I tried to explain that it was a crisis. If we did not put this board in place, it would become a crisis for bankers and hedge funds. But if we did put it in place, it would resolve their crisis, and it would be a crisis for poor Puerto Rican workers and campesinos. And they did it anyway. But it's just an idea that now we have a crisis because the rage and the pain of the people at the bottom has burst out so that it interferes with the functioning of the system. And there's really no mystery about the origins of the earthquake we're experiencing now. Nikema Levy Armstrong, who's a local leader here, I remember 4 or 5 years ago when we were dealing with the police killing of Jamar Clark, warning the city officials that Minneapolis is going to be the next Ferguson. And the powers that be in Minneapolis basically shrugged. They looked around at the stable institutions, the functioning city government, the traffic systems and so forth, and said, I don't see any earthquake. And of course, that turned out to be true. The pressures of the fault lines of racism, inequality, toxic exposures have been building for generations, of course, occasionally releasing in earthquakes, in social earthquakes, which, like those along the San Andreas Fault, can release over time, so once in a while they accumulate to the point of creating a really big one. And that, of course, is what's happening now. So when I first came to the United States from Puerto Rico, it was in a time of mass social movements. And it was in the period of, a year after I arrived, or yeah, just about a year, Martin Luther King was killed. And there was smoke rising over the city of Chicago and Baltimore and Philadelphia and Newark and San Francisco, and really about another 100 cities. And again, that's the kind of moment that we're in now. But there's a real difference in that at that time, the US global empire and economic system had not quite reached the peak of its power. Its global power, stability, and dominance would be reached in the early 70s, and it's been in decline ever since. And now these same kinds of actions, the same kind of crisis is emerging, but in a very different environment during the period of slow decline and disintegration of the US as an empire, and the extreme extremities of inequality as the 1% of the 1% has become essentially pathological in its greed and is not willing to share even enough resource to work as a sedative against the pain of the poor. So how do we, the real issue that we're facing, I think, is how do we get through this crisis in a way that we want to? How do we come up in a position that moves us toward where we ultimately want to be, knowing that we're not the only ones looking toward a future and trying to shape it to meet our own needs. Right here in Minneapolis, we have a lot of different conflicting interests operating on the street, including the entire Black population with alliances with indigenous, native, white, Asian, and other people. You have white supremacists coming in and trying to burn down Black businesses, libraries, and post offices. You have the government, various factions of it, like the Trump government in Washington and the local Democratic governments and so forth. So the question is, how do we come out of this? And how do we come out of it really has a lot to do with how we understand what is the North Star that we're trying to navigate toward. And again, this has to do with that connection between our ultimate goals and the land that we're stepping on. If we're just looking at the North Star, we're going to trip over roots. If we're just looking at the ground, we're going to wander off and not end up where we want to go. And it's not always direct, because if you're escaping the slave system and traveling north, you want to keep that North Star in mind, but you're going to be running up against huge boulders, swamps, populated towns, rivers that you need to find a safe place to get across, so that going north can mean going to the east, going to the west, sometimes even to the south to get around an obstacle. And there's been a lot of difficulty in this country in working for social change in a way that takes into account both that those short-term needs and that long-term vision. Starting about 4.5 decades ago, we saw the rise of what's called the nonprofit system, which is really based on short-term needs, short-term visions, looking at the ground, seeing what people need, but not really being attached to any kind of North Star, other than the simple principle that we don't want people to be hurting so bad. And that makes sense when we understand that this system is funded by the 1%. So that if you say, well, we want a world that's not dominated by corporations, you're not going to be able to be funded. Or if you say our organization is going to show up in solidarity with other groups who are dealing with other issues, you're not going to get your funding. The lawyers on your board are going to tell you that's outside your mission, that's not in the grant proposal, and so forth. And I think we're really at a moment when that entire system is up for scrutiny, because there's no way we can move forward without understanding the connections between all our issues. Police brutality, the police system, was put in place it has roots going a little bit farther back, but it was established and expanded and entrenched to break the promise of emancipation following the Civil War. And it would do that through criminalization, through channeling huge numbers of Black people into the criminal justice system, as it's euphemistically called, to lease them out to plantations in the beginning, but also simply to provide people with felony records, with criminal records, as they're called, that blocks access to good jobs, education, the ability to vote, access to credit, to land ownership, participation in politics, and all these things, so that all of these things would be preserved as a special privileged areas for white people. Which also explains a lot about how the country works, because being sheltered from this harsh reality, most white people are extremely naive about not only how the country works, but specifically about the police. It's like, we've always been treated well. They only mess with us if we do something wrong. So why are all these black people doing bad things, right? It's natural, because we all see the world through the lens of our own experience. When I arrived in Chicago, I was coming from Indiera Baja, Puerto Rico, a small coffee growing community in the Western Mountains. And much of the way I experienced Chicago was through the lens of that childhood experience growing up, essentially in the forest, because nothing in my world had a fast forward button, a beep, a download ability, chat capacity, or a pause button, right? When rain accumulates in a puddle, it does so until it fills up and overflows. Or if in a dry period, it depletes until it's empty. When a bird lays an egg, there's no fast forward button. You can't just say, oh, a bird laid an egg, let me push the fast forward and get to the good part and see the bird hatch. Everything has its time, its cycles, its tipping points, and so forth. I grew up in a world where there was a rainy season and a dry season. That mattered because all of the water that we used was collected from the rain that fell on our roof, was channeled, through, a culvert into a downspout, into a tank, right? So that in the dry season, we had to respond to that reality, use water more frugally, and so forth. And I also learned a lot from animal interactions. When you see a lizard and a scorpion doing battle, which is a lot like watching Jurassic Park in very slow motion. They're just sort of circling each other. And there's no way to look at that and fit it into a narrative of good guys and bad guys. Who's the good character and who's the bad character, the white hat and the black hat, right? These are two creatures fighting to have their own needs met in the best way they know with the abilities they have at hand. And that kind of entertainment that I had as a child, because there was no television, really served me well coming as a young preteen into the streets of Chicago in a time of crisis. Because I was particularly impressed with the organizing work of the local chapter of the Black Panther Party, who were building this very creative alliance with white street gangs, Puerto Ricans, and so forth, and helping to politicize them. Looking at it through a lens of, well, why are these people hurting, rather than how do we mess these people up, right? And entered into dialogue with them. And that made sense to me as someone who grew up watching lizards and scorpions. So of course, you figure out what are the needs that everybody is trying to meet, and see if there are commonalities. And that's really run through all of my political experience. Another thread of this has to do, I guess you would say, with healing. And ecosystems heal, bodies heal, nervous systems heal. It's something that starts to happen the moment that there's any kind of injury. And all systems heal themselves. The soil heals itself. Communities heal themselves. As long as we can shelter them from the kind of toxic influences, oppressions, and insults that cause us to forget about that natural capacity that we have. Once you stop poisoning the coral reefs, they start to regenerate. Once you stop poisoning and tilling the ground, the complexity of soil ecosystems returns. And once we stop bombarding ourselves with emotional, cultural, and chemical toxicity, our minds and bodies and hearts start remembering how to be human in the way that we were meant to be. I felt the impacts of moving, of immigration, of political crisis, of adolescence all hitting at once, and ended up leaving home when I was 15 years old. I dropped out of high school about a year later. Thank goodness I was drawing all the time, because that was certainly a form of therapy. And even more so, I was able to be captured and nested by the political and social movements of the time. And these are movements that were explicitly about restoring power to people whose power had been taken away, which is really also your elevator definition of trauma healing. It's restoring power when power has been taken away. So in a way, I think being able to be in those movements, seeing that happen in real time, just simply was like bathing my own nervous system in the message that yes, healing is possible. Trauma can be overcome. And for me, that was a very healing experience. I understand that those moments are also very traumatic for many people, that my experience isn't always normalized, but it has instilled in me the idea that when we organize in ways that are healing, that's just as important in reaching our goal as simply having a nice sounding goal of healing. So I was drawn into activism by the police murder of a couple of young Black community leaders, and spent the next year supporting several years supporting their organization, which was the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, who was kind of a Puerto Rican equivalent, as well as anti-war activities and all these other things that were so intimately intertwined. And as I mentioned, the way in which the Panthers created what was called the Rainbow Coalition has still left an influence on the way I work. It was a very hopeful way of organizing a vision, and that one that also tied together direct service to people in the community, much like the mutual aid types of activities I'm seeing all around me in Minneapolis right now and in many other cities, along with militant political action and with education and community organizing. Right? This really interesting blend. So after that time, I spent my early years working in factories, hospitals, restaurants, print shops, a lot of those kinds of workplaces. Ended up gravitating to the screen printing industry, and for many years have been able to work out of various collectives or out of my own studio, doing the kind of social movement, social justice artwork in connection with these movements. And starting about 15 years ago, I noticed that I was getting on in years, that before you knew it, I'd be 50. And I really, if I was gonna have some kind of midlife crisis, I wanted to be able to pick whatever looked most enticing to me. And most of the traditional options on the table I wasn't interested in, or I knew had unforeseen downsides, or were class or status inappropriate. I'm not interested in red sports cars. And what I decided to do was really delve into the history that I had lived through and that which came before, and try to figure out some of this complicated stuff. Look at, well, what are the cyclical natures of social movements? How can I translate my understanding of the forest into the political world I was living in and understand these crises? And so I started to do that, sort of looking at, well, what was the experience of people in the Black Panther Party? What worked? How did they survive in a time when they were under so much violent pressure that many of their leaders never even met each other, because any number of them were always in prison at any given time or on trial? What was the experience why was the experience of the women's liberation movement so different here than it was in Latin America, where it was one continuous struggle from the 19th century through to the present, whereas in North America, it came in waves. It came to a complete stop after winning the vote. And then there was a third wave, second wave, and then later a third wave with these interruptions. What was that about, right? How is it that the African National Congress became the spokesperson for the South African freedom movement, despite the fact that there was a lot of sort of tactical incompetence and inability to settle on any one strategy at the leadership level, right? What was going on there? And, you know, and these, just looking for these patterns. What are the patterns we can learn that can be applied to other situations? What can I learn from my own experience organizing in the hospital where I was working, organizing a union, or in solidarity work, support work with farmers, or around issues of war and peace, right? And that led to bigger questions. What is the relationship between mutual aid projects, confrontation, and community organizing? Between identity and unity, between short-term and long-term goals. So that's kind of been really my life's work since then, and working with organizations and movements and testing it out, listening to people on the ground and trying to bring some of these insights to bear. So Puerto Rico has been going through some literal earthquakes for a while, as well as political ones. There have been major earthquakes happening starting in December, sometimes major, sometimes minor, and they haven't stopped. There were some really big ones at the beginning, and they're continual tremors. My sister is living there now, so she is literally planting during an earthquake. She moved back last fall and is on the land that we grew up on, and has cleared some land and is planting vegetables. She just messaged that she ate her first homegrown tomato the other day, and it was delicious. There are other things coming up, planting some fruit trees, but and this is sort of emblematic of the way that we have to be thinking about the long-term cycles, even when the short ones are demanding our attention, even when, you know, she wakes up in the middle of the night with the house shaking, not knowing if she should leave and go find shelter elsewhere, or, you know, set up a tent or not. But still the work of farming, of planting needs to go on, and of paying attention to those long-term cycles of the rainy season and the dry season and the hurricane season. So I'd like to pause for a moment and just give some of you a chance to meet each other. One of the questions, you know, that I sometimes ask folks, coming from my own experience, I remember when I had to describe to somebody how it is I ended up doing the political work I was doing, without thinking about it, one day I just said, Fred Hampton sent me. Fred Hampton was the young leader of the Black Panthers who was killed by the police. And he's the leader who had this marvelous vision of how you build multiracial alliances and how you build power based on solidarity instead of blame and resentment. And his way of thinking was so embedded in my DNA that I thought I just blurted out, Fred Hampton sent me. So Francisco is going to wave his magic technological Zoom wand and break you into groups of 3, or at least 3 little windows. I know there's, in some of cases, there are a couple of you sitting together. And you'll each have maybe a minute or 2 just to tell each other, who sent you? Who sent you to a moment where you're looking at the world with some kind of passion or commitment to making it better? And that can be someone in your family. It can be somebody who inspired you. It can be somebody in your in your historical past. It could be a child who you've raised. It could be children yet unborn. But I want you to think about it. And even if it's multiple, just pick one and share with each other who sent you. And we're not going to share that out when we come back. We're going to get back into storytelling, but it'll be a chance for you to think about that and share among yourselves. So Francisco, it's magic wand time. So in the little window, it asks you if you want to join your group. Please join. All right, welcome back. Looks like we're all back. How you all doing? Did you learn anything? All right. So what I'd like to do with the sort of the rest of my time until we get into questions and answers and start interacting in that way. Okay, good. Is first of all, invite you to consider a little bit of animal neurobiology. Obviously, that would be the next thing we would do, right? And after that, we can delve into how both that and what we've talked about so far applies to the struggle around policing as it has developed in Minneapolis over the last 4 or 5 years, and how that feeds into this current moment, and how this current moment will feed into the next moment. It's really about that now versus then. How do we integrate those in a way that continually leads us toward where we want to go in a rhythm that we can align with. So think about how you are feeling right now. Are you cold? Are you warm? Are you hungry? Maybe a little bit sleepy or too hyped up? Do you need to go to the bathroom or stretch your legs? I mean, just think about those things, right? Dismantle patriarchy. I mean, whatever it is that might be irritating you. So when conditions become uncomfortable, we notice them. And when they become uncomfortable enough, we take some kind of an action, right? We go to the bathroom, we drink tea, we call a meeting. Fetch a blanket. So I want to read you a little quote. It's kind of in scientific academic language from a neuroscientist who studies insect navigation, right? How do insects find their way back to their nest? How do they look for food? Those kinds of things. So bear with me for a moment and I'll just read it to you. One of the main functions of all brains is to take sensory information, use it to generate an estimate of the current state of the world, and then compare it to the desired state of the world. If the two don't match, compensatory action is initiated, which is what we call behavior. Okay? So our senses tell us something about what is going on. We compare that to what we feel should be going on, and then we do something. That's what behavior is. So how the heck do we have an internal map of the world that tells us what it should be like, right? How is it that bees and humans and chipmunks and salamanders all have something to compare the world to guide our actions? And a lot of that just comes down to our animal selves, right? We want to be at a comfortable temperature. We want to feel safe. We want food and water, the ability to move where we want to move. We want connection with others of our kind. We want to be able to satisfy our curiosity. You know, you can think of other ones that could go on that list, right? But those are the things that motivate us. And those are also the things that we fight for in our struggles for social justice and in our struggles for liberation. So that, you know, for example, the instinct for safe shelter might express itself as a struggle against gentrification or for rent control. The need to eat can be a campaign for a living wage. The need to relax and play can turn into a struggle for accessible parks or more recess for our children, right? So all of the things we're struggling for come down to those basic our animal selves. And what capitalism does as a system is that it tries to monopolize our access to those needs and charge toll for accessing them. and charge as much toll as possible and give us as little as possible, so that our satisfaction becomes degraded, because it's cheaper for a corporation to produce non-nutritious food from depleted soil than rich food from a complete healthy ecosystem, right? And the way that system works is by convincing us that that's the only way we can meet our needs. We have to go through them, right? And a lot of political history is the struggle of elites trying to prevent the people underneath from realizing that there are alternatives, right? From thinking that there are other places to go. When Rachel Carson, the marine biologist, wrote her book, Silent Spring, about ecological danger, this was back in 1962 or so, when environmentalism wasn't on people's minds, it made a tremendous impact, right, on people's consciousness. Silent Spring, there'll be no more birds, right? And the corporation Monsanto came out with its own response to that, which was a little play, which they called Dismal Summer. And it was about how horrible the world would be if it weren't for synthetic chemicals, right? So the idea is to try to convince people that there is no alternative, there is no other place to go. And part of that is actually trying to monopolize access to things like water. And part of it is also trying to monopolize access to the idea that there are alternatives. I've been reading about the history of the Caribbean in the last couple of centuries, and how so much of the struggle of the colonial powers in the 17 and early 1800s was really devoted to keeping Black folks from talking to each other. In other words, they couldn't figure out how there were these networks, this grapevine happening throughout the enslaved, the indentured, the sailor, the seafaring worlds, so that news of what was going on in Europe and elsewhere was always buzzing through the enslaved people in the plantations, and fomenting rebellion, and also fomenting escape, because everybody knew that there were villages of freed people who had freed themselves out in the forests in Haiti and in Jamaica and in other places. And suppressing that knowledge was just such an obsession of the wealthy. Even in this country too, the Seminole Wars in the early 1800s, the US government, the Seminole Wars were made up of contingents of Black escaped slaves and of Native people. And they joined together in the Florida Everglades, and they fought in separate units. And the Black units were pretty effective. They knew what would happen if they were defeated, right? They were pretty motivated and very successful in defeating the US Army. I think half the US or 3/4 of the US Army was battened down in those Everglades, trying to win. And the government suppressed, forbade the reporting in the newspapers in well, not the colonies anymore, in the United States, the states, any news of Black units defeating white people, because that would demoralize the whites and give the Blacks ideas of what was possible. So all of this question about our imagination of what's possible, based on information about what others have done, controlling that or freeing that, really to a large extent it can determine the course of history. Is there another place to go? Do we know that there's another place to go? Is there a battered women's shelter in your community? Do women in the community, particularly women, know that it's there, right? That knowledge. Can we imagine a better world in another place? So this is what we were up against when the group that I'm part of started organizing around the police in Minneapolis. And that was based on the realization that in another year, it was going to be 2017, and that was going to be the 150th anniversary of the police department. So dang, that's a good opportunity for telling a good story. Let's do a performance review, which we eventually published. Some of you might see that in mirror writing, some of you forward, depending how you have it. It says enough is enough. A 150-year performance review of the Minneapolis Police Department. And, it's really quite a lovely piece of work. You can tell that this organization was founded by artists of various sorts. We wanted to make everything beautiful. But we were up against a moment in which every time there was a crisis, right? The police killed somebody, the community would be outraged, would be mobilized, and would demand some of these tepid demands that never made any real difference. Like, we want another civilian review board. We're on our 6th by now. We want implicit bias training for cops. We want residency requirements for where they live, diversity hiring, right? We want more cops of color. We want the federal government to put them under federal control for a year and clean up the corruption. And these are just a hamster wheel cycle. They never actually make a difference. You know, or if they do, it's like for 6 months before they get reversed. And then people get demoralized because it's no longer healing to call out what's going on if there's no solution, if it's not leading to anything, right? It just becomes re-traumatizing. So in the early days of the Black Lives Movement, you know, naming what was happening was liberating. And after the 100th time, it just becomes re-traumatizing. We were looking for a way to shift that narrative. And so through this process is how we chose to do that, right? How do we create a narrative that tells a different story? And we worked under the radar. We didn't want the police to know what we were doing. We created teams. At one time, we had 4 or 5 dozen people working in working groups, doing interviews, digging into the history, interviewing social service workers and school counselors and battered women's shelter counselors to see what their experience with the police was, interviewing people in the community about how their community might solve problems if there weren't police there. And we came up after a year with this report, launched it to a huge filled hall, and already were impacting the mayoral and city council races because the police were being asked, the candidates were being asked if they could imagine a police-free world, and some of them said yes. And the powers that be held a press conference to say, no, that's a really bad idea. Don't think about it. Don't look at it over here. That idea there. Don't look at it. Right over there. Right? It was really kind of lovely. But you know what we found. We shared the interviews and the history, a comprehensive history. We made an audio book, a exhibit that we held in one of the most over-policed areas of the city. We did zines. We're about to publish a comic book, reaching people in many different ways and shifting the conversation. And I'll wrap this up by saying that I'll read you our 5 essential findings. The police were established to protect the interests of the wealthy, and racialized violence has always been part of that mission. The police cannot be reformed away from their core function. The police criminalize dark skin and poverty, channeling millions of people into the prison system, depriving them of voting and employment rights, and thereby preserving privileged access to housing, jobs, land, credit, and education for whites. The police militarize and escalate situations that call for social service intervention. And there are viable, existing, and potential alternatives to policing for every area in which police engage. So what has happened simply in the last week, today marks 1 week since George Floyd was murdered by a Minneapolis police officer in front of the world, fully expecting that nothing would happen to him, as you can tell if you've ever seen that. Not that I recommend looking at it. But our organization gave birth, and influenced the formation of a coalition of groups, the Reclaim the Block Coalition, that through working with the city council and hearings and mobilizing communities was able to force over $1 million out of the police budget into community healing organizations that the coalition itself named, right, having concrete impacts. And now that the crisis has exploded, we are seeing the language that we introduced into the community here, because at the beginning when we started talking about a world without police was like, that is so naive, so pie in the sky. And now it's become clear that a world with police is naive, that it's truly not viable. And that is coming out in the language of local leaders, politicians. The University of Minnesota just severed all ties with the Minneapolis Police Department. The school board is voting on a resolution to cut all contracts and contact with the Minneapolis police. Businesses are canceling their protection contracts and so forth. and people are demanding the dismantling of the police department and the creation of alternatives. And of course, there's a lot happening in the broader world, and the work of our little group can't take complete credit for these kinds of changes, but it nonetheless has been significant. And so we see the slow, patient, quiet work of changing and shifting that narrative of what's possible. You know, saying, oh, you know, people don't imagine a world without policing because there is no place to run to. There is no place outside of policing. We've said, actually, there is, and it's a better place. And now people are starting to demand it, right? So now when we're in this moment of crisis, how do we plant seeds for what comes later? Well, we're seeing a remarkable outpouring of mutual aid, of collecting resources, of donations of emergency supplies. There's some sounds going on in the background here because my studio where I'm sitting is one of those drop-off places. There are organizations throughout the city, throughout the Twin Cities, community defense against people who are destroying the white supremacist crews that are coming in, the collection of food, the taking over and negotiating control of an empty hotel for homeless people, medical care, food drives, emotional and mental healing support, and physical support, community cleanups. And so during the quiet moments, we're working quietly to change the narrative. During these moments of crisis, we're putting in place the elements of the new world that needs to be, so that we're learning that, oh, it is possible to have community self-protection, because the police are certainly not protecting us. They're opening fire with rubber bullets and tear gas canisters at medic tents and at the injured people and so forth. They're not there to help us. And the city isn't stepping in and providing people with food, water, and other emergency necessities. Community is. So now during the crisis, our task is to strengthen these responses so that when the actual moment of flames and burning settles down to ashes, which eventually it will, we have collected from this moment some precious things that we can take with us to create the practices of the future. And if we come into another period when the movements recede, then we're taking that knowledge and trying to bring it the next step further so that when the next crisis comes, we'll be in a better place to move us forward again. Because in a very real way, crises are our report card for the work we've been doing in between them. So let's pause here. I'm going to take a breath and let John channel to us some of the questions that have been coming in.
Thank you, Ricardo. There are some questions that have rolled in. Some are being repeated. Could you confirm or add to the list of ways to respond? We have on that list, raise consciousness about what is possible, increase discomfort to encourage change, empower the impressed in any area of their world, build capacity. Question, what else? I think there were a number of people like me who were trying to furiously take notes as to the words of wisdom and encouragement you were providing.
Right. Well,
did we miss anything?
Well, why don't you read me a couple more questions and I'll try to respond to see how they can synthesize.
Yeah. They're kind of rolling in as we speak. There was a friend who asked about repeating the 5 realizations about the police your group came up with and asking how to obtain a copy of the report.
Mm-hmm.
Who wrote the zines related to changing the way police function in communities, and can people learn about the process you use to create them? I think perhaps since you alluded to the fact that this was an artist collective at a very core element of your organizing, it might be helpful for friends if you elaborated a bit on that imaginative piece with artists in the forefront to give vision and a new narrative and also to visualize it?
Okay, so I'll start with that and then move back toward the other question. And we weren't an artist collective, but there were a lot of artists involved, and we approached things with an artist sensibility, which of course has to do with imagining the invisible and making it visible and finding new ways to tell truth, right? So that's where that creativity came in. Our members wrote the zines. We were multi-age, multiracial, multi-gendered, collective. Different parts of our work are different groups engaged in. So there's a group of Black teenagers on the north side that helped with the interview part. There's some high school activists who have been active in the comic book that we haven't released yet, in writing this, creating the section on cops in the schools. The process, actually, I'm glad you asked that, because the process has been really a remarkable experience for all of us involved in it, to be involved in a group that had very genuinely horizontal leadership. No one was in charge, where over the time, if anyone needed to step back and take care of their lives, they were welcome to, and we welcomed them back with open arms when they could. Where people really left their egos at home. And I think it's because it was hope-based organizing. It's like when you really feel there's a goal you can achieve, and it's an exciting one, not just a tepid one, it becomes less and less important that your idea is the one that's adopted, or that your voice is the loudest. So it was a very encouraging, nurturing culture within the group. And in fact, the process we developed for making decisions and so forth, we felt was important enough that we've created an oral history case study so that other communities can learn from this. So it hasn't happened yet. We're finalizing it. We're reissuing our original report and including it in a larger volume that includes our case study, which answers the kind of questions that you're asking. It includes the comic book, a multi-artist comic book, incidentally, different stories by different people. It includes photographs and some of the articles that we published in the press during the course of the development of the struggle. Because while we don't have the answers, we have come up with a model that was remarkably effective for us, and which we think other communities and other cities will be interested in. As far as the elements of change, there are a number of different lenses we can use and different lists that are all equally viable, right? Some are ecological. I've been writing about some of that. What I will say though is that the important thing is not so much what is the list of change, but what is the center point in my own self that allows me to figure it out as I go, right? It's, well, how can I turn myself into an instrument and train my intuition? So we start out with what we know, which are some of the things that you listed, and we experiment with them. Talking with people about what's possible. One of the things we learned is that a beautiful vision of what's possible doesn't matter unless you also help people see the pragmatic steps to get there. So you all say, yeah, let me sit back and daydream with you about that, but then I got to get back to the real world, which isn't like that, right? We need to be able to create pathways. And sometimes we'll find things that we apply a lesson and we find out that maybe it doesn't work quite the way we thought. Because one of the things you read to me was, increase people's discomfort until they want to change. Well, that depends. Because for a lot of people, they're living with that discomfort, right? So that, and I've dealt with high school teachers who were caught in that conundrum, right? Or with the high schoolers actually who came to me, where they were feeling very disempowered by a class about social justice. And it turns out that the teacher who came from a white middle-class background wanted to share with these kids the way he became aware of things in the world. So he grew up feeling that the world was basically a safe and benign place. And when he learned that it was oppressive, it was like a revelation to him. It gave him this shot of adrenaline and opened his eyes to a whole new way of seeing things. Now he's talking to kids who come from poor communities, dark communities, who experience racism, experience class, experience all of these dangers and injuries, police harassment, and to tell these kids, hey, guess what? I got news for you. You're going to be so excited. The world is really messed up, right? So for these young people, that's not empowering, right? It's not, an increasing discomfort is not empowering for them. The medicine for them is the idea that that's not, it doesn't have to be that way. And just as important, that you have within you the capacity to help move toward another world. And here are some stories about people like who did that, or here's an experience we can do together. We'll all go camping and you'll see how you can, experience self-empowerment, right? So that in our relationships with people, once we believe it's possible to help people blossom and become powerful, then we start seeing ways to do that. And as we start experimenting those ways, we start learning what works and doesn't work.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think this question, it may be pertinent to some of us on the line as well as the questioner. What starting points have you found most helpful to talk with, and I'm going to assume with white family members and folks still on the fence about the possibility of police abolition?
Well,
where might you start that conversation as opposed to having already done that massive amount of work and provided materials?
Well, it's like any healing modality, you start with the patient. It depends who it is, right? So some people, historical storytelling is fascinating. Oh my God, the police were set up to fulfill that function. Oh, did that ever change? When might it have changed? Oh, I can't find it. So that can be an interesting thing for some people. For others, it might be another route, but I think it always starts with validation of a person's experience, right? So when you tell somebody that you have been able to achieve what you have achieved because you're privileged, you've handed all of this on a silver platter, right? Because you're white. Well, that's not going to sit with somebody who knows that they struggled, that they went through hard difficulties, that they saw their parents struggle for that cabin on the lake, etc. So I think it's important to validate that and then say, well, that's really wonderful. I love that cabin. I remember when we used to go out there when I was young. Did you know that until 1974, it was written into the bylaws of the Lake Cabin Association that owners could only sell to white people? Isn't that unfair? Wow. So these other families who worked just as hard for that dream of having a cabin on the lake didn't get it, right? And yes, you worked hard for everyone, and these other people who have worked just as hard were not allowed to do this, that, or the other thing. And the cops were constantly, hassling their kids, giving them false, charges that they had to plea bargain for, so they wouldn't go to jail, which meant that they couldn't get the jobs they needed. Blah, blah. So people do have a sense of unfairness. What is it that your uncle, your racist uncle, has experienced in his life as being unfair? How can that feeling be utilized? Sometimes the story he attaches to it is really toxic. You have to figure out the best approach. But I think the place is always about connection, and that connection can come in funny ways. That I don't have time to tell you the stories, but I do have several really important stories from my own life and others that have taught me that simply being who I am among people who are pushing back really hard about everything I believe is very powerful and can plant seeds that turn out to be life-changing for people later. It's like I've had those conversations. People I never thought I was getting through to, saying, those kitchen table talks we used to have really impacted the choices I make in life. So sometimes it's not always important to always do battle. Just zero tolerance for racism, cluelessness, sexism, or whatever else. But it's important to hold that space and that confidence and that groundedness in your vision of the world so that they need to respect you, you're not treating them badly, and ultimately there's someone you turn to when the world catches fire. Or at least those seeds you planted, start to grow. There's a story of a Jewish couple who helped a racist skinhead in Wisconsin at a time when he needed it. And it was like, that didn't change his worldview. That didn't impact him, but it was a little pebble in his shoe. And with an accumulation of other experiences, the way he describes it now, that he's an anti-racist lecturer, is that was just one of the accumulation of pebbles that when the time came, made a difference. Another metaphor to use other than pebbles is scattering seeds. What we knew in MPD 150 is that we were scattering seeds. We didn't expect them to grow this soon. We figured we would close out the organization after 4 years and hope our work would continue in certain ways out in the community, the materials we created, and someday when the rains came, they would grow. Well, all of a sudden, rainy season came 10 years before I thought it would. And those seeds are sprouting all around us. We have time for one more?
Yes. I'm going to ask my question now. If we have a little bit more time, we can do one more. I learned today from a feed by a very reliable source that the white supremacist organizations were taking advantage of the somewhat of the protest movements and chaos created in the streets to advance their own agenda, one. And I also heard a leader of the a young African-American male leader of the Black Lives Matter movement in Denver complaining about allies who were coming onto the scene for their own agenda rather than following the leadership of people of color. I would like your take on sort of building on the story that you told about the white teacher's enthusiasm for here I am and I've just discovered that you're oppressed, in terms of how being an ally in these particularly turbulent times might play out, and also as to what you have observed on the ground in Minneapolis about the involvement of white nationalists and militant groups.
Yeah, well, I think both of those contain truths. Definitely, we've been seeing racist white groups, people coming in from Wisconsin, Michigan, Texas, North Dakota, and even Alaska. Some of those have been arrested, others not. Volunteers have had to run off armed racist, white supremacists. They've been setting fire to libraries or trying to, libraries, post offices, Black-owned businesses, et cetera, right? I'm not saying that those are the only sources of fire by any means during an insurrection, but yeah, that's definitely happening. And yeah, the idea of white saviors coming in of whatever flavor, it's always a problem in times of struggle, and not listening. And a lot of times, white people of any class or identity or politics tend to think of their political action in terms of their identity. So it's like, I am a nice white peace activist, and I'm not the kind of person who breaks things or violates laws. So I will line up, and do my passive form of civil disobedience and politely walk into the paddy wagon and be taken away. Or other, people from a different persuasion might be, my identity is that I don't, I have zero tolerance for the empire. I will not allow I will confront the police or anybody else at any moment. And break anything associated with the system, because that's the kind of person I am. I am free from the system and I won't be a part of it or collude with it in any way. So all of these are about who I am rather than what are the implications, what are the outcomes, who do the consequences fall on, and so forth. But yeah, that's always true. I mean, one of my posters says nothing about us without us is for us. And we have to always walk that line among us. I've lived here for 40 years. I'm a Puerto Rican. I'm not going to impose my ideas on the emerging, young leadership of the Black community, even though I'm from here, right? And it's true even, any of us going to other communities. And we have to be careful about the outside agitator language, because solidarity often does mean showing up for each other and traveling, going to Standing Rock. And Standing Rock also experienced white inexperienced people coming in and trying to impose themselves. But that's part of our report card. That means we have not done the education work we needed to do during these ensuing years so that we would be prepared for that. Our communities would know how to deal with it, and there would be enough consciousness among the white activist movements that they would be able to monitor themselves. People have come up with mechanisms to try to do that. But again, because people in the calm times aren't imagining that there'll be a time of crisis again, they're not invested in preparing for it. I also want to say that probably tonight, maybe tomorrow, we'll be posting a new message on the mpd150.com site that has some further ideas of what people can do in terms of the current crisis anyway, not necessarily in terms of the world in general.
I think we should go ahead and leave it right there. I thank you, and I know that there should be thumbs up from our viewers for your taking this time to be with us on a program that we planned some months back, not knowing that you would be in the midst of the moment of an earthquake to deliver this address. So we are holding you in the light as we hold the situation in Minneapolis and all around the country in the light. And we will keep looking at your website for further responses to some of the questions that I think we didn't get to. But thank you so very, very much, Ricardo. Blessings on you and all you are doing.
Be well, be safe, and be powerful.
Thank you.